The hotel bar was half empty. Some conference crowd, a few business travelers, nobody paying attention to the man in the corner booth, nursing a club soda and watching the door. That was me. I wasn't drinking because I wanted to be sharp. I wanted to remember every single second of what was about to happen. Across the street, the Harwell Institute's annual gala was 3 hours from starting. The banquet hall had been booked for 6 months. The program had been printed. There was a plaque. I'd seen the design mock-up because someone on the committee had emailed it to Leonard, and Leonard had forwarded it to me, the way he always did when he wanted me to feel included in something I had actually built. Dr. Leonard Hask, Lifetime Achievement in Applied Research, in recognition of a career that redefined the field. I had read that line maybe 40 times in the last week, not because it made me angry anymore, because I needed to remember what it felt like, that specific flavor of erasure. For the moment I'd been working toward for 14 months. My phone was face up on the table. I was waiting for a call from Marcus Webb. Marcus, who I hadn't known existed 18 months ago. Marcus, who had handed me a manila folder across a diner table in a city I'd never visited, and said, "I've been waiting 7 years for someone to show up." The call came at 7:04 p.m. I picked up. Marcus said 2 words, "It's done." I set the phone down, picked up my club soda, and I thought about the last time I saw Leonard smile at me. Really smile. The kind that reached his eyes, which was at my wedding 6 years ago, when he stood up during the reception and told a room full of people that I was the finest mind he had ever trained. He meant it as ownership. It took me a long time to understand that. I wasn't angry anymore. That was the thing nobody tells you about this kind of betrayal. The anger doesn't last. What replaces it is something quieter and much more precise. I checked my watch. 3 hours until Leonard walked into a room that was no longer waiting to celebrate him. I ordered another club soda. I had time. I want to be honest about who Leonard Hask was to me, because if I'm not, none of what comes later makes sense. He wasn't just a mentor. That word is too clean for what we were. He was the first person in my professional life who looked at my work, really looked at it, and said without hesitation, "This is exceptional." I was 26. I was 3 months into my research fellowship at Harwell. I had spent the better part of my academic life being told I was promising, which is the word people use when they don't want to commit to believing in you yet. Leonard committed. He pulled me into his office after I presented a preliminary framework on behavioral adoption models, something I'd been developing quietly for 2 years, something I was still apologizing for in my own head. The way you do when you're not sure if your best idea is actually good or just yours. He closed the door, sat across from me, and said, "Ryan, who else has seen this?" I told him no one. He nodded slowly, like that was the right answer. "Good," he said. "Let's keep it that way until we develop it properly. I don't want anyone picking at it before it's ready." I thought that was protection. I wrote that in my journal that night. Leonard wants to protect the work. I was 26 years old, and someone I respected was treating my ideas like they were worth guarding. You don't question that. You feel grateful for it. That was the first lock he put on me. I just didn't know it was a lock. Over the next 2 years, Leonard became the architect of my professional life. He introduced me to department heads, conference organizers, and journal editors. Every door I walked through, his hand had opened it first. At the time, I read that as generosity. He was giving me access, pulling me up, doing what good mentors do. What he was actually doing was making sure every relationship I had ran through him. I had no independent contacts. No colleagues knew me without the footnote of Leonard's endorsement. No professional identity existed outside of his framing. I didn't see it because it didn't feel like a cage. It felt like a career. By the time I was 30, I was the most professionally dependent person in that building, and the last one to know it. The wedding was in 2019, June. Small venue outside the city, maybe 90 people. Leonard sat in the 3rd row with Diane. She wore pale yellow. He wore a suit I later realized cost more than my monthly salary at the time. which should have told me something about how Stratfield Advisory Group was doing. Except I didn't know Stratfield Advisory Group existed yet. He gave a toast, stood up without being asked, glass in hand, and said that watching my career develop had been the privilege of his professional life. That my work was going to matter. That he was proud. My wife cried. My mother cried. I shook his hand afterward, and he gripped it with both of his and looked me in the eye and said, "You've earned everything coming to you, Ryan." He was right. He just didn't specify who it was coming from. The first sign was a silence I didn't know how to read. Dr. Ellen Marsh ran the Applied Research Division at Harwell. Sharp woman. 20 years in the field, the kind of person who remembered everything you said and held it against you fairly. We had always been cordial. Not close, but warm enough. She'd cited my early work in 2 of her papers, which in academic circles is the equivalent of a firm handshake. Then, sometime in late 2020, she stopped making eye contact. Not rudely, just carefully. The way people do when they've been told something about you, and they're not sure how much of it to believe, but they've decided to be cautious anyway. I noticed it at a department meeting in October. I noticed it again at a faculty lunch in December. By January, I had cataloged 6 separate interactions where Ellen Marsh had been warm to everyone in the room and neutral to me specifically. I told myself I was being paranoid. That's the thing about narrative poisoning. It works because the target does half the work themselves. Leonard didn't need to convince me that something was wrong with me. He just needed to plant the seed in enough people that I would eventually feel the chill and fill in the explanation myself. And I did. I spent 4 months in 2021 quietly wondering if I had done something wrong, said something off, if there was some professional misstep I couldn't identify. I became smaller, more careful. I second-guessed presentations I would have delivered confidently 2 years earlier. I started prefacing my ideas with apologies dressed up as qualifiers. This might be off base, but I could be wrong here. However, the verbal equivalent of making yourself easier to dismiss. Leonard noticed. He told me I seemed tired, said I should take a few days, squeezed my shoulder. I thanked him. The conference was in September 2021. Mid-sized industry event in Cincinnati. The kind where the real conversations happen in hallways and hotel bars rather than panel rooms. I gave a presentation on updated adoption modeling. Work that had evolved significantly from my original framework. Work I was genuinely proud of. The room was engaged. The questions were good. I walked out feeling, for the first time in months, like myself. Sarah Odom found me 20 minutes later by the elevator bank. Sarah was a behavioral researcher at 2 institutions over. We'd overlapped at a few events, exchanged papers, and the usual academic acquaintance track. She had this quality I always appreciated. She said what she meant without wrapping it in 3 layers of professional softening. She said, "Can I talk to you about something uncomfortable?" We found a quiet corner near the fire exit. She told me that at a research director's dinner 8 months earlier, Leonard had described me to a table of 6 senior people as, and she paused here, like she was making sure she had the exact words right, extraordinarily talented but increasingly erratic, the kind of person you root for but can't rely on. She said she'd assumed I knew, that it had gotten back to me somehow, that I had addressed it. I hadn't known. I stood there, and I felt the last 4 years rearrange themselves in my head. Every cold shoulder, every evaporated opportunity, every room that had gone slightly quiet when I walked in. Leonard had been in those rooms first. I drove home from Cincinnati and I didn't tell my wife what Sarah had told me. I just sat in the driveway for 20 minutes after I parked, staring at the garage door. I sat in the driveway for 20 minutes after I parked, staring at the garage door. Something had finished shifting. I just needed to figure out what to do with where it had landed. I didn't confront Leonard. That was the first and most important decision I made. Every instinct I had said walk into his office, put it on the table and demand an explanation. That's what he would have expected. That's what he had probably planned for. He'd had years to prepare his version of events, years to practice the wounded mentor face, the disappointed sigh, The gentle reframe where my anger became evidence of exactly the instability he'd been describing to people. So I didn't give him the scene he'd rehearsed. I smiled. I showed up. I kept sending him draft papers for feedback. I kept copying him on emails. I performed the same Ryan Calloway I had always been. And behind that performance, I started pulling threads. The first thread was financial. Leonard's salary at Harwell was public record. Senior Fellows' compensation was disclosed in the annual institutional report. I had never looked at it before, because it wasn't my business. When I looked at it in October 2021, the number was what I expected. Comfortable, respectable, not wealth. But Leonard had recently renovated his house. I knew this because Diane had mentioned it at a department holiday party. The offhand way people mention things they're proud of. We finally redid the kitchen. It took forever, but it's beautiful. I had smiled and said congratulations and moved on. A kitchen renovation in that neighborhood didn't come from a senior fellow's salary. I started paying attention differently. The second thread was a name: Stratfield Advisory Group. I found it by accident. Not even by searching for Leonard specifically, but by running my own name through a research database to check citation counts, which I did periodically. There was a consultancy white paper from 2019 that cited a behavioral adoption framework. The language was familiar in the way your own handwriting is familiar. The structure, the terminology, the specific sequencing of variables, it was mine. Not similar to mine, mine. The author credit reads, Stratfield Advisory Group. Lead consultant, Dr. Leonard Hask. I sat with that for a long time. Then, I searched Stratfield Advisory Group directly. The company was registered in 2017. 4 years of operation. A client list that wasn't publicly posted, but whose footprint was visible if you knew what to look for. Conference sponsorships. Industry citations. A LinkedIn page with a logo and no employees listed except Leonard as founder and principal. I found 3 more white papers, all post-2017. All drawing from frameworks I had developed and shared with Leonard in the years prior. Work that lived in shared drives and email threads. In the draft documents I had sent him for feedback, with the implicit trust of someone who thought they were being mentored. Then I found the client deck. It was attached to a cached version of a now-deleted page. Someone had not been careful enough about scrubbing. The deck was a pitch document for a Fortune 500 engagement, dated 2020, the year I had been most productive, most collaborative, most open about sharing developing work with Leonard. Page 7 had a credentials section. Under our research pedigree, Leonard had listed 3 frameworks by name. All 3 were mine. Below that, in smaller text, a line that made my jaw tighten. Research developed in collaboration with Harwell Institute Fellows, including Ryan Calloway. Not stolen outright, just repositioned, reframed. My name was used as a credential to sell my own work to clients, who were paying Leonard for it. I printed every page. I bought a locked filing cabinet the same afternoon. I hadn't even found the worst part yet. The document wasn't hidden. That was the part that stayed with me longest. It wasn't encrypted, wasn't buried in a separate drive, wasn't protected by anything more than the assumption that I would never think to look. It was sitting in a shared project folder Leonard and I had used for 3 years, a folder I had access to, had always had access to. Had simply never excavated past the first 2 layers of subfolders because I had no reason to, until I had every reason to. I found it on a Tuesday night in November, at 11 p.m., my wife already asleep, the house quiet in that particular way that makes everything feel more permanent. The file was named RC Profile and Viability Assessment, dated 4 months before Leonard and I ever met. I opened it. It was 6 pages, single-spaced, my name at the top like a header on a procurement form. Leonard had mapped me out completely before our first conversation. Academic background, research focus, publication trajectory, personality indicators drawn from peer references he had quietly solicited without my knowledge. There was a section titled Network Isolation Index, an actual heading, those actual words, where he had noted that I had no established senior advocates, no institutional allies outside my immediate department, and a demonstrated tendency toward professional loyalty once trust was established. He had written, in the margins, in his handwriting, self-contained, low extraction risk, low extraction risk. I was an asset he had assessed for the likelihood that anyone would notice if he took what I produced. There was a section near the end, titled Timeline and Utility Horizon. He had projected, in 2013, before we shook hands, before he told me my work was exceptional, before my wedding, before any of it, that I would have a productive research output window of approximately 8 to 12 years before either institutional advancement or independent reputation growth would make me less useful. He had budgeted a decade of my life. I sat at my desk and I read the document 4 times, not because I didn't understand it, because I needed my understanding of it to fully replace every previous version of my history with Leonard. I needed the rewrite to be complete, the mentorship, the wedding toast, the shoulder squeeze. You've earned everything coming to you. All of it was inventory management. I closed the laptop, went to the kitchen, stood at the sink for a while, looking at nothing. Then I went back to my desk, opened the laptop, and started making a list of everything I was going to need. The lawyer's name was Janet Osei. A colleague from a different department had mentioned her once in passing. Intellectual property, institutional disputes, the kind of cases most attorneys don't want to touch because the defendants are respected and the paper trails are complicated. I called her on a Wednesday morning, from my car parked 2 blocks from Harwell, engine running. I told her I needed a consultation. I told her it was sensitive. She said, "They're all sensitive. Come in Thursday." I laid everything on her conference table, the white papers, the client deck, the Stratfield registration documents, the profile document with low extraction risk in Leonard's handwriting, 3 years of shared drive records showing the timeline of my work predating his publications. Janet went through it without speaking for 20 minutes. When she finished, she took off her reading glasses and set them on the table, and looked at me with the particular expression of someone doing math in their head. She said, "How long have you been sitting on this?" I told her, 6 weeks. She said that was actually smart. Then she told me what I was looking at. IP misappropriation, fraudulent credential use, potentially tortious interference given the pattern of reputation damage Sarah had described. She said the profile document alone was something she had never seen in 15 years of practice. She used the word extraordinary twice, not as a compliment, as a legal assessment. Then, she told me what I needed to do before anything else. I spent the next 3 weeks moving quietly. Every piece of research I had in shared institutional drives got transferred to personal encrypted storage. Every email thread documenting my original development of contested frameworks got forwarded to a private account and logged with timestamps. Janet filed a preliminary IP registration on 4 frameworks, not aggressive, not visible, just establishing a dated record of ownership that would matter enormously later. I didn't change my behavior at Harwell by a single degree. I attended Leonard's Friday research meetings. I sent him a draft paper for feedback. I asked him about his weekend. He told me about a dinner he and Diane had attended. He said it was lovely. I said that sounded nice. Then I went home, and I found Marcus Webb. It took 9 days. A deleted acknowledgments section in a 2015 paper Leonard had scrubbed from his official bibliography led me to an obscure institutional repository, which led me to a name, which led me to a university faculty page in a mid-sized college 3 states away, someone who had quietly left the field and just as quietly never explained why. I sent a single email, "Mr. Webb, my name is Ryan Calloway. I think we need to talk." Marcus Webb took 4 days to respond. When he did, it was 3 sentences. He said he knew who I was. He said he had been waiting for an email like this for 7 years. He said he was available any day except Thursdays. We met on a Tuesday, a diner in a mid-sized city neither of us lived in. His suggestion, which told me something about how carefully he still moved. He was already sitting when I arrived. 50-something, quiet, the kind of stillness that comes not from peace but from years of having nowhere safe to put your anger. He had a manila folder on the table in front of him. He didn't touch it until after we'd ordered coffee. He talked first. Leonard had taken Marcus in 2009. Same architecture, the early recognition, the manufactured dependency, the slow professional isolation. Marcus had been a rising researcher in organizational psychology. By the end of his relationship with Leonard, he had been quietly removed from 2 grant applications he had co-authored, had a misconduct inquiry opened against him based on allegations he was never fully shown, and had resigned from his institution before the process concluded because his lawyer at the time told him the costs of fighting would exceed anything he could recover. Leonard had kept Marcus's unpublished dissertation framework, had published a derivative version of it in 2011 under his own name. That paper was currently cited 412 times. Marcus knew the exact number. He slid the folder across the table. Inside was everything. Original draft manuscripts, with Leonard's feedback comments in the margins. Comments that proved Leonard had read and understood the work before claiming it as his own. Emails from 2008 and 2009 show the development timeline. A letter from Leonard to Marcus's department chair, obtained years later through a Freedom of Information request, that described Marcus as a promising researcher whose judgment had become concerningly unreliable. Word for word, the same language, 7 years before he used it on me. I put my copy of the RC profile document on the table. Marcus read it slowly. When he got to low extraction risk, his jaw tightened. He set it down and looked out the window for a moment. He said he has a methodology. I said, I know. We spent 3 hours in that diner. By the end, we had a structure. Janet would file a joint ethics complaint with Harwell's Institutional Review Board. 2 complainants, a documented pattern, corroborating evidence across a 15-year timeline. Simultaneously, a separate IP claim would be filed naming Stratfield Advisory Group in both our cases. Marcus had his own attorney. The 2 firms coordinated the following week. The award ceremony was 6 weeks out. We filed 5 weeks and 4 days before it. The ethics board chair received the complaint on a Monday morning. Janet told me later he had called Leonard's department head before noon. Leonard got a call that afternoon. I was in a research meeting when it happened, sitting 8 feet from Leonard's office, watching through the glass wall as he picked up his desk phone, and his face did something I had never seen it do before. It lost its arrangement. Just for a second. Just long enough. I looked back at my notes and kept writing. Leonard called me that evening at 7:23 p.m. I watched my phone vibrate on the kitchen counter, his name on the screen. That professional headshot he'd never updated. The one from a conference in 2014 where he was mid-laugh, looking like someone's favorite professor. I let it ring. He called again at 7:41, then at 8:05. Then a text came through. The first text Leonard Hask had sent me in 11 years of knowing each other, because Leonard didn't text. Leonard called. Leonard needed to hear your voice so he could modulate his response in real time based on yours. The text said, Ryan, I think there's been a serious misunderstanding. Please call me. This is important. A misunderstanding. 14 months of documentation. 2 complainants. A profile document with my name on it dated before we ever met. And the word he reached for was misunderstanding. I put the phone face down and finished making dinner. The next 72 hours dismantled him from the outside in, and I watched it happen from a distance with the detachment of someone who had already grieved the relationship years before the relationship ended. Connor Slate called me first, which I had not expected. Connor was 29, 18 months into his fellowship. Still at the stage where Leonard's approval felt like oxygen. He left a voicemail that was equal parts confused and panicked. He'd heard something. He didn't know what to believe. He wanted to know if I was okay. What he actually wanted was to know which way to stand. I called him back. I didn't tell him everything. I told him enough. That the complaint was real, that the documentation was substantial, That he should talk to his own department advisor and make sure his name wasn't attached to anything connected to Stratfield Advisory Group. I said it calmly, without editorializing. Connor thanked me. Then he went quiet on Leonard. A mentor's power evaporates the moment his next protege stops returning calls. Sarah Odom emailed me on Thursday. She'd heard through department channels that an ethics review had been opened. She wrote 3 lines. She was glad I had done something. She was available if I needed a supporting statement. She was sorry it had taken this long to tell me what she knew. I wrote back 2 lines thanking her. I meant them. The institutional response moved faster than Janet had projected. Harwell suspended Leonard's departmental voting rights pending investigation by Wednesday. His Friday research meeting was quietly canceled. No announcement, just an absence on the calendar that everyone noticed and nobody addressed out loud. His Harwell email signature lost its department chair advisory title by the following Monday. Each thing disappeared separately. That was what made it land. Diane called my wife on Friday night. My wife came into the kitchen afterward and stood in the doorway with an expression I couldn't fully read. She said Diane had been crying. Diane said she didn't understand what was happening, that Diane had asked if there was anything we could do. My wife looked at me for a long moment. She said, "She knew, didn't she?" I said, "The firm is registered in her name." My wife nodded slowly, set her phone on the counter, and started clearing the dinner table without another word. Leonard's final attempt came on Sunday. Not a call this time. An email. 4 paragraphs. The first was about our history together, the early years, what he said he had genuinely believed about my potential. The second was about context, how research relationships were complicated, how attribution in collaborative environments was never clean, how he had perhaps not always been as careful as he should have been. The third paragraph was the pivot, something about mutual resolution, about moving forward, about the damage prolonged proceedings caused to everyone involved. The fourth paragraph asked me to call him. I read it twice, then I forwarded it to Janet with a single line, for the file. The ceremony happened, just not the way Leonard had planned it. The award committee didn't cancel the gala. Canceling would have required an explanation, and institutions protect their events before they protect their people. What they did instead was quietly remove Leonard from the program. No announcement, no statement. The printed programs had already gone out with his name on them. So what attendees received at the door was a single inserted card. Due to unforeseen circumstances, the Lifetime Achievement presentation has been postponed. Postponed. That word did more damage than a cancellation would have. Cancellation implies accident. Postponement implies waiting, and everyone in that room knew what they were waiting for. I was across the street in the hotel bar when Marcus texted me that the card had gone in. I read it, set my phone down, and felt something I hadn't expected. Not satisfaction exactly, not relief. Something quieter than both, the specific stillness of a thing being finished. I thought about the last time Leonard had looked at me with that full wattage mentor smile, the pride, the warmth, the careful performance of someone who had made a significant investment and was pleased with how it was developing. I had spent years trying to earn that look. I understood now that I had never been trying to earn anything. I had already been purchased. The IP claims settled 8 months later. Stratfield Advisory Group was dissolved by court order. The client contracts built on misappropriated frameworks were voided. Leonard and Diane's legal fees consumed the renovation, the investments, and most of what remained of the consulting revenue. Diane's name on the registration documents meant she was not a bystander. Her attorney negotiated separately. It was not a good negotiation for her. Marcus received a formal institutional acknowledgement from Harwell. Not an apology. Institutions don't apologize, but a letter recognizing that the 2009 misconduct inquiry against him had been opened on the basis of false and retaliatory information. He framed it, sent me a photo. I understood completely. I returned to my research. Not with fanfare, not with a redemption arc announcement. I just went back to work. The frameworks formally reclaimed, The IP registered in my name, the record corrected in the places that mattered. 2 journals published corrections to Leonard's papers. The citations now read differently. The field is small enough that people noticed. Connor Slate reached out 6 months after the settlement. He was at a different institution, different advisor, starting over in the way young researchers do when they realize the ladder they were climbing was leaning against the wrong wall. He asked if I had any advice. I told him to own his work completely and share it carefully. He said that sounded lonely. I said it sounded like a career. I don't know what Leonard is doing now. I haven't looked. That's not restraint. That's just the truth. There was a time when his opinion of me was the weather I lived inside. Warm when he approved, cold when he didn't. And I had arranged my entire professional life around predicting the forecast. That time ended. My wife asked me once, near the end of all of it, if I was glad I had done it or just relieved it was over. I thought about it for a while. I said, I'm glad I waited until I could do it right. She said, that's a very you answer. She wasn't wrong. The last thing I did, the night the settlement was finalized, was open the shared project folder one final time. The RC profile document was still there. I downloaded a copy, not because I needed it anymore, but because I had decided it belonged to me. Then, I deleted it from the shared drive, removed access, closed the folder, and went to bed at a reasonable hour.